we're at a point where we're really starting to unravel this whole narrative around psilocybe. This is probably not showing up very well. But essentially, psilocybe emerged 65 million years ago as a wood decomposer. We expect that probably during that period of time when whatever event happened, that extinction event that happened 60 to 65 million years ago, a fungi essentially got to, have a bit of a time taking over the world and really evolving in new ways. And psilocybe, one of those species that kind of came out of that time period. So originally they were just decomposing probably a lot of wood that had been just, decimated. There was no light. The atmosphere was full of dust. So there was probably a lot of tree death, plant death. Fungi would have been having the time of their lives. At various points, though, psilocybe over that time period since have evolved to adapt to soil, so humus, dung, and a multitude of different wood substrates. Psilocybin is the prodrug of psilocin. So psilocin oxidizes and it causes that iconic bluing of psilocybe magic. Psilocybe, so magic mushrooms. So essentially psilocin oxidizes and it creates this this dimer molecule that they bond together, and it's this large chunky molecule that we expect then probably has a physiological effect on things that are predating on the mushroom. So these big crystalline structures that are probably gouging through the intestines of slugs and snails and insects. So it's a protective compound. I have an alternative theory, but anyway, we'll maybe experiment with that in future MardiGrasses. The genus Psilocybe in Australia. Traditional knowledge is unknown and unrecorded. We expect that species such as Psilocybe cubensis, Psilocybe semelanciata arrived in Australia in the 1800s. Possibly even on the first fleet, some people speculate, because they did collect apparently cattle from India on the way here, and India is iconically known to be associated with Psilocybe cubensis. So they may have come over with the cattle that were collected during that trip, or subsequent trips. The first record of Psilocybe semelanciata was in New South Wales in 1895 by mycologist McAlpin. And then in 1918, mycologist Cleland and then colleague Cheel named two Psilocybe species, Psilocybe aggregata and Psilocybe muscii, and I'll come back to those. Psilocybe seborrheigosa. It really is a mouthful, and everybody struggles with it, including me, apparently. Psilocybe seborrheigosa was first collected in 1915, but then it wasn't named and described until 1927. The first key of Psilocybe in Australia was published in Cleland's Toadstools and Mushrooms and Other Larger Fungi of South Australia, parts 1 and 2, published respectively in 1934 and 1935. Now, going back to Cleland, so last year I did a similar talk here and I got pulled up essentially about the history of psilocybin mushrooms in Australia, that there is a traditionally recognised narrative that it was through people travelling here from overseas, educating locals about the mushrooms here, so surfers or hippies travelling from California. And I kind of went home thinking about that, and so I went back to Cleland, and it was just like, in Cleland, in the part 1, Cleland notes, some species of toadstool give rise to a kind of intoxication, noting the mushrooms ingested were probably a dung-inhabiting species. Interesting. Cleland goes on to mention a story about a colleague whose relatives accidentally had a misidentified fungus. And apparently they had this to say: as the meal progressed, they gradually became more and more hilarious, the most simple remark giving rise to peals of laughter. The intoxication passed off without any unpleasant effects. Kind of interesting, huh? But, you know, it's not quite a warning, you know, but how many people have then actually taken this comment seriously and gone, well, I'm going to go looking for these. So maybe there is an untold story of people consuming Psilocybe cubensis or other psilocybes for the effects that, you know, us today go and forage for them and consume them for. I'm really curious about this and I would love to know more. But then also in Cleland, 1934, there were all these species mentioned. So Psilocybe ceres is now Laradiomyces ceres, so Larry's. Those of you in Victoria, from Victoria, will be familiar with those. And then a whole group of others, which have essentially all been moved over into other genera. So like into Lacrimia, Sathirella, Paniolus. Gaston Guzman in 1978 assessed a lot of these species and said, well, probably Sathirella, and in some cases there was no type specimen, which means that mycologists can't go back and make a reassessment. So it's like we have a species that's listed, but we don't have a type specimen, so did it even exist or is it something else? From current conversations, it really starts to feel like we need to do a complete reassessment of psilocybe in Australia. But anyway. But these supposed poisonings continued. In some cases not in a good way though, unfortunately. So Psilocybe cubensis is probably responsible for a number of poisonings reported in case studies by Trotter, so from 1944, and also by Stocks in 1963. Aberdeen and Jones in 1958 published a hallucinogenic toadstool in Australian Journal of Science. And this paper described the distribution of Psilocybe cubensis through northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland, including Springbok. Apparently, now Aberdeen is a really well-known mycologist in Queensland. He wrote an identification guide that was kind of regarded as the main ID guide for southeast Queensland for quite some time. But he developed quite a curiosity around Psilocybe cubensis, and people have suggested that that interest may have been a little bit more extreme and experimental than may have been kind of recorded. So who knows, maybe Aberdeen was out there trying some magic mushrooms and having a good time and keeping that to himself. Mycologists do this. I don't. So what are then our origins of our countercultural knowledge here in Australia? You know, like, so McCarthy in 1971 has this quote: "For some time, young drug users have been aware of the existence of legendary mushrooms, but information regarding the habitat identification and effects were lacking." Well, I kind of disagree, having gone back to Cleland. It seems that the necessary information was supplied by a visiting surfer from New Zealand or the USA. Well, I'm kind of starting to disagree with that particular comment. And who knows, you know, like, we've all done it, haven't we? Like, you know, some poisonings may have just been misadventure, and I definitely feel there's an unrecorded narrative. And then back to kind of the scare campaigns, you know, people going and finding mushrooms and either, you know, getting caught jumping fences or having a bad time. So there were magic mushrooms in the news. So there was an article in the Sydney Sunday Telegraph in 1969, and then there was a Canberra Times article in, you know, two actually, July 11 and July 12. Unwanted tourists. The mushrooms contain drugs. And then that information spread. So and there was also some scientific literature coming out at the time to then demonstrate the Psilocybe aeruginosa also contained psilocybin. And so kind of around the same time we had articles turning up from the Adelaide Advertiser, you know, many taking a trip on Hills mushrooms. And then we have the Daily Telegraph. Pupils getting high on gold tops, another Queensland article. In the 1970s, research kind of, I guess, solidified again. We had Watling from Europe came over and made collections of Psilocybe australiana and Psilocybe eucalypta and Psilocybe tasmaniana from New South Wales and Tasmania. These species were then named and described by Guzman and Watling in 1978. Guzman and Watling in 1978 also then mentions another 26 Psilocybe species. And to come back, right back to 1918, Cleland and Cheel, Psilocybe musci is considered doubtful, and Psilocybe aggregata is most likely a Satharella species. And then another list of supposed species that have now been moved into Satharella, Diconica, Homophron, Agaricus, Hypholoma, Diconica. You get the idea. A whole lot of species that were considered Psilocybe have just been moved into a whole other genera. Essentially what is now in Psilocybe are the blue staining Psilocybes. Other mentions in literature, so Victorian Toadstools and Mushrooms, that beautiful orange covered book that I showed a couple of slides back from 1963. There's this lovely little hardcover book, Tasmanian Mushrooms and Toadstools by Eigelsheim, 1981. It's definitely worth it if you can find a copy. It's a lovely little book. Famous mycologist John Allen, in collaboration with Merlin and Jensen, wrote an ethnomycological review of psychoactive agarics in Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure if you have been onto Erowid, you may well have seen that. It's also a nice little guide. And then there was Larger Fungi of South Australia by... Thanks. Gergonovic, something like that. So, nobody, I don't know anybody who can pronounce it. And I love this particular piece from the Australian Natural History magazine. Mushrooms, Poisonous, Edible, Hallucinogenic by Tim Lowe. And I think, and I've had to edit this ever so slightly, amateur mycologists know more about these species than the scientists. In 1972, P. colobioides, which we now know was Psilocybe aeruginosa, because colobioides has never been in Australia, never been recorded here, was recorded botanically from Australia for the first time. The specimens were collected by police from a fridge in Tasmania. The dried out crushed fungi were being packed into gelatin capsules for illicit sale in Hobart at $6 a hit. So I don't know what that equates to, but it's probably actually quite a bit. And given the price I've heard for microdosing, it doesn't surprise me. Times have changed. You know, what was seen as a recreational drug being used in non-clinical use is now regarded as a breakthrough therapy kind of thing. You know, the psilocybin therapy is becoming a very, very real thing. And again, we're going to have Martin Williams talking about that and related compounds shortly. But very briefly, a few years ago, mycologist Alistair McTaggart obtained a permit to collect and study Psilocybe in Queensland, and he has really gone to task on cubensis and Aeruginosa and has made some really, really nice discoveries about species in Australia. I'm not really going to talk in detail to those, but perhaps another time. But also we have cases where Reset Sciences in Western Australia and Funky Fungus in Queensland both obtained permits to cultivate, and we expect others to be doing the same. You know, but all across the world you've got all these bodies who are and sort of local governments who are, you know, pushing for the use of psilocybin for treating mental health issues. There's decriminalisation happening, and there are permits being handed all over the place for new research. So it's lovely to see. Okay, currently recognised species. So Australia can be broken down into two zones, temperate zone and subtropical, tropical zones. So we have in the temperate zones, we have Psilocybe aeruginosa, we have Psilocybe eleuticea and Psilocybe similanceata. Then in subtropical, tropical zones, we have Psilocybe cubensis, Psilocybe papuana, and Psilocybe samuiensis, which is a kind of newly recognised species. And I'm going to mention a few later, but because they're not named and described, it gets a little bit problematic. We also have a bunch of allied species. So we have the Gymnopilus group, so Gymnopilus gynonius, which in Australia is not active, although some people will debate on that point. But we have a group of others that are potentially active. But I don't know if anyone else here has eaten Gymnopilus, but these things taste nasty. Like, I don't know why you would go there, and really the dosing is, well, we don't really know properly, but you have to eat quite a bit to get anything. Then there are the subtropical allied species, Paniolus cyanescens and Paniolus cinctulus, and there are a couple of others. There's also the associated species Amanita muscaria, which I mention here because it's regarded as the magic mushroom. And on that note, don't eat it fresh. I recommend research on this species before you even consider. If you're interested in Amanita muscaria, I'm talking about it tomorrow at 11 o'clock here. So we can go into a bit more detail, and I'm just going to skip over it for now. Sorry about some of the technical stuff, but this kind of needs to be mentioned in order to kind of talk about it in a bit more detail. But when Guzman described psilocybe in 1983, and when he's revisited it on other occasions, like 1995 and 2004, he keeps referring back to these things called sections. Now, Singer had his own group of sections, and Nautilus in 2011 also had his own other group of sections, just to make things a little bit more, you know, confusing for all of us. Everyone refers back to Guzman. I mean, he was the one who defined them, so we all just refer back to him. Originally, sections were set up in order to classify different groupings within psilocybe based on microscopic features. So these are things like spores, pleurocystidia, and the other cystidias. But there was a paper in, I think, 2012 that essentially showed that microscopic features are really not taxonomically relevant in a lot of the psilocybes. Like, we actually have to dive deeper to really kind of get an understanding of the relatedness and all the associations properly. We still use sections though, because we, you know, even as a crude summary, those features are still present. You know, different sections have different appearances. Section similanceata, for example, just have that really distinctive, very long, tall, narrow, but very, very fibrous type. So yes, so we still refer to sections. That may change. Who knows? Someone else may come along and just redo the whole genus, and particularly with the genetic information that's coming out, and it's coming out really quickly, things may change sooner than we expect. But so just to kind of recover some of those species in terms of sections, section Seberogenosa, we have Seberogenosa, cyanescens, azurescens, and alenii, since these three latter species are probably just Seberogenosa. They are probably represented in Australian populations. We have then section Semilanceata, so Semilanceata, Eleutheria angulaspora, which is an introduced species, likely, and it's the one that's turning up in Bunnings pots, for those who are in the know. Next time you're in Bunnings, go check out some of the pots. You may find some curious fungi. Top hint. And then we have this weird thing that we refer to as Tasmaniana, but is a newly kind of noticed, or we don't know where it's from really, but it's unnamed, it's undescribed. Section cubense is Psilocybe cubensis. Section mexicanae, we have Samuiensis. Section Zapotecorum, there have been possible identifications of Aucklandiae here in Australia, and there's also some undescribed species from that section. And section Cordyspore, so Psilocybe papuana, and there's been other species noticed that are yet undescribed. I'm going to pass through these fairly quickly. If you want to take photos of the descriptions, please go ahead and do so. I'm not going to read through all the details. There's a lot of information here, and it will just slow down the talk if I just kind of read it all. And I'd like to give you time for questions as well. So Psilocybe seberogenosa is one of the two really iconic species here in Australia. So you've got cubensis up here in northern New South Wales and Queensland, and in Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, parts of New South Wales, but also in southeast Queensland. This beautiful mushroom appears in around this time of year. Its habitat is wet and dry eucalypt forest. It can also be found in eucalyptus and pine plantations, and quite often in wood-chipped garden beds. So, you know, anyone who's kind of curious adventitiously of, you know, they turn up in wood-chip beds, you can encourage them, you cannot, it's up to you. These are quite widespread, and I guess this is kind of out of date, really. I mean, if Azurescens, Cyanescens, and Lanii are actually Seberogenosa, then we're also talking now North America and also Europe, in addition to New Zealand. So, there's a bit of a question around the Southwest WA population, whether that was an introduced population, but I know that there's now some genetic evidence that demonstrate that there may have been an endemic population in WA, but someone was asking about more date research, and this is the kind of research that now needs to happen, is to actually dive into the population of Seberogenosa itself and to look at the populations and how they interact, how they interbreed, and potentially how they've spread. You know, that is probably a PhD or even a few PhDs in itself. So, you know, if you're doing a bachelor's degree and want to get into psilocybe, that's exactly the kind of PhD I would be recommending. The season is, well, they typically need a cold drop down to 6 to 8 degrees. But there seems to be population variance in that. Like some of the New South Wales populations seem to happily fruit at like 12 or even 16 degrees. It's just like, well, why is New South Wales getting mushrooms before Victoria? Good grief. And I think that's because of that population. You know, there's different genes that control the fruiting mechanisms, and it seems that the New South Wales population has a higher threshold. The season is April, May to July, August, climate permitting, depending on where you are in the country. For those who are maybe a little bit confused by the terminology, this is wet sclerophyll. So these are eucalyptus mixed with rainforest trees. You can see the man ferns throughout this photograph. that's kind of fairly indicative of wet sclerophyll forest. It's forest that is typically moist on a regular basis. Contrasted to dry sclerophyll. You can see this is really dry. There's lots of woody debris though on the ground, but when it comes down around the winter time, this gets really wet and moist, and that's when the mushrooms, you know, really start to emerge and fruit. So dry sclerophyll tends to fruit a lot later into the season than the wet sclerophyll. This is Psilocybe aeruginosa, that beautiful caramel cap. You've got the remnants of the cortina, the partial veil, this beautiful long white fibrous stem. Like, these are really tough and really quite fibrous. You can squeeze them, and I mean, and that's another kind of indicative thing of psilocybe, is that you should be able to wrap the stipe around your finger and it doesn't snap. It's so fibrous and tough that it should remain intact. The gills tend to start out in a white colour, and then in time will become kind of mottled and then darker with age. Their attachment is adnate to adnext, which is a fairly regular feature through the genus. These things can bruise really blue. You know, they have a really high psilocybin content. So they've been clocked at like 1.93% psilocybin. So they are up there as sort of one of the more potent species. There's a whole other narrative around all of the psilocybin cup people and other groups now doing testing, and they're kind of people, and cultivators are really pushing that boundary. So, you know, it gets a bit murky and a bit fuzzy, and it would be really nice to see, I think, more relative comparisons between the actual production of psilocybin. Here's some more just pretty pictures. So that kind of really beautiful kind of peaked cap in one case. Here is that very, very cyanescent, sinusoidal looking cap. And this is kind of your fairly standard with a nice little peaked umbo. Beautiful mushroom. Here's another group growing out of a log. The colour on this is terrible, but here and here you can see it, they're just kind of growing out the base of this log in the forest. I would call this dry sclerophyll. So this photo was taken in late June in a dry sclerophyll forest. Here's an incredible cluster. They don't normally do this, but in wood-chipped beds or really well with beds with lots and lots of wood chips, this is becoming fairly common. These really dense clusters of fruits. A few more examples. Here you can see the beautiful white gills. Again, that kind of peaked umbo, and that incredible bluing on the stipe. I love this species. Can you tell? And this is an example of some of the phylogenetic trees that are coming out, but this is from Jerry Cooper in New Zealand, but Alistair McTaggart's are much better, and I probably should have really put in Alistair's rather than this, but things are starting to get really interesting, and we now know that ITS is highly problematic as a barcoding tool for this particular section. It's a watch this space thing. And here's one of Alistair's charts. So from different groups, so like the Bunya population, the Scenic Rim, here's the Clifton Hill population, that is very, very closely associated with Psilocybe cyanescens. Oh, there's Clifton Hill and Clifton Hill. And then there's a few others, so there's like Tasmania, so Clonarney, Denern, and there's Adelaide and a few others. So with more genetic information, this chart should, in theory, turn into like a big circle, which is kind of indicative of it being one species. Selection Simulanciata. So this is Psilocybe eludicea. So this grows in wet and dry eucalypt forest. It grows out of animal dung pretty well exclusively. It grows in Tasmania, Victoria, and it does grow in New Zealand and possibly northern New South Wales as well. It does require a little bit of cold, and the season is March to July. There is now a little bit of evidence, but we need people to actually, you know, go back to some of the other collections by Watling. But there is now a possibility that Psilocybe eludicea is actually Psilocybe tasmaniana. The descriptions overlap in a very, very significant way. So at some point, we'll probably stop talking about eludicea and just refer to it as Psilocybe tasmaniana. But we need someone to go back to Watling's samples, his holotype that's in a herbarium in Scotland. So, kind of just jump through this very, very briefly. So you've got the conical and convex cap. You can't really see it here, but again, it's hygrophonous. It's a common feature in Psilocybe. The gills are adnate. They're greyish brown, but they have this really quite typical Simulanciata style kind of stem, narrow, very, very long and fibrous. They do bruise below, but typically kind of down the base, and that's a typical feature of this section. Here's another example, and this looks very, very similar to Diconica. They grow in the same habitat. It's possibly one of those examples of convergent evolution, of where a species kind of has evolved to look very, very similar to another species because of a shared habitat. This is Psilocybe simulanciata, so liberty caps. It grows in open grassland. It's an introduced species. Typically grows on decomposing grass. So you'll find it in long grass, and it's associated with stock animals, so sheep, cattle, horses. It grows typically in Tasmania and Victoria, but it has turned up in South Australia and in alpine New South Wales. And is the one that's kind of known typically from Europe, where it just grows through pastures like mad. It seems to be a little bit rare in Australia, but I challenge particularly people from Victoria, go looking for this thing. I bet you'll find it more than you actually think. It does require cold, and it has 2 seasons. It has like a March to May and then an August to October season. So I'm putting that challenge out there. Go out there, find it, put it on A Naturalist, and I bet it's a lot more common than people think it really is. It has a very, very distinctive cap. It has a really, really quite a distinct pellicle, which is kind of like an extended umbo on the very tip of the cap here. It has that really long, narrow stem, and the cap is quite kind of conical. It can kind of expand a little bit. When they're really old, they will start to curve upwards a little bit. And look, like most other psilocybes, they're a kind of adnate to adnex attachment. They have a hygrophonous cap, so they will change colour in time. And they also, this one does have a very distinctly, easily removable gelatinous pellicle. Section Cabensae. So Psilocybe cabensis. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with this one. Open grasslands, introduced species, growing from cow pies. Mostly from Queensland, northern New South Wales, possibly also growing in Northern Territory. There's recently been a confirmation that Panaeolus grow in Northern Territory, so we suspect that if you're finding Panaeolus, you're probably also finding Psilocybe cubensis. But anyway, we're still waiting on reports for that. So, and the season is when it's wet and humid up here. So I've got November to February, but I know that it does extend outside that. And in tropical parts of the world, this mushroom fruits all year round. Here's just some examples. This probably doesn't really show off, but you can see that darkening in the colour of the gills, so light, and then becoming mottled. Growing in open grassland on dung. Another example. Bit more of a description. So it's conic to convex. It has an umbo. It's very, very typically red-brown when it's young, and then becoming a golden yellow colour with age. It has a universal veil that drops from the margin of the cap and becomes an annulus, a skirt, and it's a fairly distinctive feature of it. And the stem is white to yellowish with age. So, and here's an example of the change in colour of the cap. So you can see it's got this beautiful kind of dark brown, almost reddy colour. It starts to lighten with age. It becomes kind of golden and white on the margins. And then you get that kind of bluing colour come through on the margin with a little bit of the gold cap remaining. Newly noticed species. So we have Psilocybe papuana, Tasmaniana, Samuiensis, and Gulaspora, and then we have a few oddities. Oh, sorry, I thought someone was asking a question. And then we have species from section Zapatocorum and Cordyspore, and someone has claimed that Arini is in Australia, but I'm yet to see that. You know, there's a lot of confusion around some of these newly noticed species. We don't really know the full taxonomic appearance of them, and things that grow in pots from Bunnings are not growing in their natural environment, so they're kind of restricted in the way that they grow. So that gets a little confusing. I've seen Psilocybe aeruginosa growing in pots from Bunnings, and it looks very, very different from what it does naturally. And you end up with arguments with people who are like, oh no, it's Tasmaniana. It's just like, seen it 1,000 times before, it's Tasmaniana. This is Psilocybe papuana. It's a beautiful colour. It's got this kind of green tinge that comes through. It's really quite pretty. It grows on soil, among litter, and humus. It's tropical or subtropical, found in montane forests. Look, it was originally named and described from specimens found in Papua New Guinea, but unless we also go back to the holotype and test that, this may well also be another species that we're just calling by another name. So who knows? There's lots of work to be done. But this has also been found in Victoria, in Nothofagus forest. I have a sneaky suspicion this is like a remnant population species that probably is quite ancient. You know, but again, research, tracking it down. Here's another example of it. So, section Mexicanae. So for those of you who live up this way, this might be worth keeping an eye out for. It grows in open grasslands. It's an introduced species, found growing from really wet soil. Like this, like really, really boggy, well-manured, damp soil, like after lots and lots of rain and lots of puddles. And yes, like many others, it requires rain and humid conditions. And found in New South Wales and Queensland. It was originally identified in Thailand. So whether it's introduced or whether it's endemic, we're yet to really find out. The cap is conic to convex, or convex to conic. It's umbonate with a very, very small papilla. Like others, the gill attachment is adnate, and the stem kind of has, is hollow, and it has these beautiful kind of little fibrils that run down the stem. So it's a beautiful looking mushroom. I think that's wrong. Anyway, oh no, this is right. This is in section Semilanceata. This is the flower pot mushroom, so Psilocybe angulospora, found on heavily manured soil and found in potted plants. Pretty typical in some parts of New Zealand and Australia. There's the description if you want it. This is Psilocybe tasmaniana. So this grows in open forest on dung-rich debris. So it's found currently in New South Wales, Queensland and New Zealand. The season is April to May. And yes, it's not to be confused with the original Psilocybe tasmaniana. This is an unnamed, undescribed species. Here is the description. So it has like a convex to subcampanulate cap. It's quite striate near the margins. And when I say striate, these lines on the margin of the cap, quite distinctive. And the cap tends to, particularly in the flower pot specimens, the cap really starts to push upwards. And you can see one of the features of this is that the stem kind of expands upwards into the cap, which has become a little bit of an identifying feature for these. Tasmaniana, I've kind of covered this, so I'm going to kind of flick through, but we do now assume, given the very, very close descriptions, the overlapping descriptions, that Eludicea is actually Tasmaniana. And here's some very, very blurry trees, which I'm just going to jump over. Sorry about that. I think there's another talk for next year emerging. Right. So for those of you who are interested in Psilocybe in Australia, there are some good resources. iNaturalist. If you're finding really lovely Psilocybes, please post them on iNaturalist. So we can start to track some of these interesting things that are turning up. Shroomery, Microtopia, and there's a bunch of Facebook groups as well. There are my own references, and Entheogenesis Australis, which I work for, has some really good resources, and I highly recommend you checking out the videos that I've done for them and the lookalike videos, the Psilocybe aeruginosa reference guide. Is a great little read. I wrote it. I'm still very, very proud of it. And then there's also things like how to make spore prints and ethnomycology resources that I highly recommend checking out if you haven't. Thank you. Do we have time for a question or two, or we do?
I'm sure we can.
Okay.
Can I start off with a rookie question? I'm assuming all psilocybin or psilocybin stems turn blue.
Yep.
Let's assume that. Are there any toxic mushroom stems that turn blue also? I don't know, I'm just asking.
There is the blue staining bolete, but they are so taxonomically different, and they don't have gills, they have pores. There is some blue staining mycena, but pardon?
Just from squeezing the stem.
No, I think the blue staining mycena, the blue staining boletes, yes, if you cut the blue staining boletes open, they instantly go blue. The blue staining mycena, I think, yes, you can. If you do squeeze them, they go blue. But mycena also have very, very white gills and really, really delicate stems. So that rule, like if you try to twist the stem around your finger and it snaps, Mycena are going to snap. They're really, really delicate. Other species that might turn blue, you might get the odd Inocybe, but I doubt it. Yeah, you could probably leave it at that, I think.
Any questions? I've got a mic, just because we're competing, but if you guys shout out, that'd be helpful too. Our young man can't hear. It's hard, yeah?
My hearing is shot.
So, any questions?
Have you got a book coming out? Or have you got a book?
I have a cultivation journal coming out, but I don't have any books on Psilocybe species coming out. I feel like there is one worth doing for Australia, but also at the same time, I would probably wait. I heard a rumour that Paul Stamets has a new version of his book coming out in the next few months. So do keep an eye out for that. I do question whether he's actually taken any notice of Alistair in this one. Sorry, I'm not a fan of Stamets, but you know, and anyone who reads his Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World book will kind of, you know, like he's definitely a splitter. Like he wants all the species to be species, and he very, very abruptly in the text ignored the whole synonymity between Saberoganosa, Australiana and Eucalypta. So it's going to be interesting to see what he thinks of Alistair's work. No, I don't have a book coming out on psilocybes, but on mushroom cultivation, yes.
I think it might be worth your while because a lot of us buy.
Sorry?
They all want to buy your book.
Yeah, I'd buy it.
We can't wait for it.
Cool, buy my book. Buy my book and then send me photos of your cultivation. That's what I really want to see.
Hey mate, what's known about the potency of the new species, the Allotaceae and the Papuensis and the Samuensis? Papuana.
They're not meant to be very strong. I don't think anyone's... Oh, look, I think one person may have bioassayed the Papuana. I think it was middling. Someone has bioassayed a Ludicea, and it's not very strong apparently.
So the safety profile for foraging for these is not recommended until more is known, or?
That's an interesting question. Look, I guess at this point, erring on the side of caution, yeah, you know, keep the species that you're familiar with. I don't know if it's worth pointing out, but yeah, no, like we've got this thing, wood lover paralysis, that people are talking about, and we don't know the pharmacology of it. We don't know individual reactions to it. It's kind of a little bit challenging to talk about because we don't know what the causative agent of it is, but we know it's definitely a recognised thing in the community, and there are a whole bunch of harm reduction things about that we probably need to take on board. We don't know if some of these new species are also causative agents of wood lover paralysis, and I guess till we know more, yeah, I think the common advice is go low, go slow, and build up your dose from a homogenized sample if you're bioassaying these.
Thank you.
Yeah, Caine, thanks for that talk. Really appreciate the information there. It's probably one of the most knowledgeable, information-filled discussions on the native species of psilocybe in Australia. I'm just curious if you can speak to maybe like DIY or low-tech methods that you can maybe try using to cultivate any of these wild species. I mean, we know woodchip beds work quite well for a lot of gourmet species. I think I've seen cubensis being done outdoors, maybe spore slurries and these sorts of really DIY approaches. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the PF tech is probably the easiest way to really start to get your head around cultivating each of these species individually. It's a really reputed, well-known tech. It has a minimum, it's not complicated, and it seems that everything can grow on it. So I would suggest that as a beginning point, until you kind of get your head around whether a species is more likely to prefer wood or grass, or is a secondary decomposer. PF Tech seems to cover all of that. And then you can vary the PF Tech. You can mix in sawdust and other substrates.
So just experiment purely. Do you feel like some of the wood-loving species that you mentioned there might take to a wood bed if you were to try?
Absolutely.
Inoculating those? Yeah.
Many of these newly noticed species are happily growing in wood chip beds all over the place. So I would just say, give it a go. Try the PF Tech, and otherwise, try a wood chip bed. Start out with cardboard, see if it takes to the cardboard, and then if it does, then try wood chips. And I think on that point, thank you for some good questions, and I'm going to hand over to our MC here.
Thank you, Caine. I recommend taking a photo of that slide. There's also some stickers there and there which will get you access to most of what Caine's talked about in one way or another. I guess I'm very lucky to say that I get to work with Caine a lot, and our next speaker Martin Williams. So we'll just have a moment's break for Caine to reset, and feel free to approach him and say hi. And in a moment we'll get Martin on stage and get going.
Do you have a laptop as well, or?
Getting later today. I'll see you running.